This is a graph of homeless people in Japan. Looking at it, it's pretty incredible. For a country of 125 million people, they have less than 5,000 homeless people. And as of 2024, that number is actually at 2,820, the lowest since the data began in 2003. That means just 0.003% of their population is homeless, which means they've basically solved it. It sounds too good to be true, and the reality is that it is. Let me explain.
Hundreds of homeless people in central Tokyo being forced to hide from sight.
These insanely low numbers come from the government, and asking any government to report on their own performance is like asking a student to grade their own exam papers. Japan views homelessness differently from other countries. The definition of it isn't really clear, if not manipulated. Their actual homelessness rate is very low, which is still amazing, but it's not what it seems. But to understand how Japan brought their homeless rate down to almost nothing, we have to take a look back at the past few decades, when homelessness wasn't even close to 0%. It starts from just after World War II, when the bombings that took place on the mainland left cities severely damaged, making almost 9 million people homeless after the war. At this point, Japan was left with almost nothing. But that all changed when the country went through what has now been dubbed the Japanese economic miracle. If you look at this graph here, the rapid economic growth from after the war was basically exponential, propelling it upwards in the ranks of economic power on the international stage. As for how this happened, there's several reasons. Because Japan was in total ruin and lost a chunk of its industries following the war, they really had no other choice but to rebuild from scratch. This was a blessing in disguise, because it gave them the opportunity to innovate while doing so. They didn't have to wait for old technology to run down and slowly cycle in newer tech. Since Japan was in many ways a clean slate, they could launch into it immediately. Japan's imports spiked as they brought in new foreign innovations like robots and machine tools to implement at home. Much of the capital in the nation was dedicated to investing in manufacturing, so multiple industry sectors, from electronics to chemical engineering, grew rapidly. The government was also actively encouraging business growth via maintaining low interest and low tax rates after the war, as it tried to rebuild the country as successfully as possible. The whole idea was to promote aggressive growth in business and industry, so the country could bounce back from its defeat. Japan's big businesses formed groups called keiretsu. These large groups connected banks, businesses, and trading companies, and were designed to help corporations outperform their competition. To stay ahead of competition, keiretsus developed a competitive work culture that would keep them one step ahead of their competition. It drove innovation, but also required people in the workforce to work long hours throughout their entire career. So efficiency and productivity increased, fueling the rapid business growth Japan was looking for in a post-war world. Even though its imports grew on the front end, the drive toward more production led Japan's exports to explode not long after. Japan was flexible in what it exported, bending to what was most in demand at the time, whether that was metals, textiles, or something else. Because of this flexibility coupled with the efficiency of their labor force, Japan became a notable exporter and a player on the international economic stage in just a matter of decades. By the 1980s, Japan had the largest gross national product in the world. Even now, Japan is the third largest economy in the world, with a GDP of $4.2 trillion. During the Japanese economic miracle, it served everyone very well, so the homelessness rate naturally declined in the 1960s and on, as companies needed more workers and both employees and businesses reaped the economic benefits. But as with all economic booms, the growth couldn't last forever. The good economic fortune of the 1980s was due in part to Japan's loose monetary policy. The lax regulations led to an inflated stock market and real estate valuations. This was great while it lasted, but it was clear an economic bubble was forming, so the Japanese financial ministry raised interest rates. But in the early 1990s, it burst. The stock market crashed, and this ushered in a debt crisis that would become known as the Lost Decade. A long 10 years of severe economic struggle and stagnation for Japan. The GDP plummeted. This inevitably led to higher unemployment rates, which inevitably led to high homeless rates. By 2003, there were about 25,000 homeless people on the streets of Japan. But the last decade didn't just stop by the early 2000s. Its GDP continued to stay extremely low, and then the financial crisis of 2008 hit, crushing the global economy even more, which crushed Japan even more. So their economy has been relatively stagnant for the past 3 decades. And yet, at the same time, homelessness hasn't steadily grown over those decades. In fact, it has decreased. So if the answer isn't economic growth, how has Japan reduced its homeless population to almost nothing? Well, things started changing at the governmental level in the late 1990s, when homeless groups and advocates began to grow more vocal. Tokyo, Japan's capital, started to take notice of these advocates and groups and listen to their concerns. This became especially important because, at the time, the homeless issue was growing rapidly in the country, with thousands considered homeless in Tokyo alone. Many struggled to find permanent employment, and wages were often low, which made it difficult for Japanese people to support themselves. Day laborers especially struggled with finding affordable housing during the last decade. Many homeless people were from blue-collar industries, such as construction, which suffered greatly during the decades of economic stagnation in Japan. Homelessness plagued middle-aged and elderly people more often, as they struggled to find work as they were replaced with younger laborers. These groups began to organize and push back against the government, advocating for their rights. So finally, in 2002, the ball started rolling. The government passed the Homeless Self-Support Act, which was designed to help homeless people reach a point where they could support themselves. As part of the new legislation, Tokyo created self-help support centers to help those who were homeless find employment and become capable of supporting themselves. The homeless policy of the 2000s involved several other aspects, all aimed at discouraging street life and encouraging self-help for the homeless population. The idea wasn't to just get them off the streets temporarily. The government wanted to get people off the streets permanently. The next big pillar of Tokyo's policy was to find accommodations for the homeless people who could no longer live on the streets since they were evicted from the sidewalks and public places. Tokyo offered both rehabilitation facilities and simple accommodation facilities for temporary housing for homeless people. From 2004 to 2007, it implemented a project that offered homeless people with housing for low rent that they could occupy for a certain period of time. Non-profits, often loosely backed by the government, also provided welfare facilities to help homeless people. So, from 1998 to 2010, the total number of housing facilities for homeless people in Tokyo increased by 6 times, while the capacity of these facilities as a whole grew by 2.5 times. Around the end of the 2000s, Tokyo implemented more new measures for their welfare system. A new support system known as self-help supporting housing was added to the mix, which was a sublease housing system that was supposed to act as another intermediate for people between homelessness and permanent housing. Then there's the actual laws and institutions that play a role. They have a no-nonsense drug policy. The government strictly enforces its policy against illegal drugs and discourages their use. So, as of 2014, only about 1.6% of the Japanese population, via a survey, was found to have tried drugs other than alcohol at some point in their life. This number pales in comparison to the number of people who have tried some form of illegal drug in the US, which is above 50% of the population. This illegal drug use can often lead to addiction, a criminal record, or mental health issues that ends up making it way harder to function or get a job to re-enter society, creating one big cycle. This is especially the case in Japan. If you were accused once of even a tiny drug possession, your life would absolutely be over in Japan. Society never forgets what you did, and your crime record never leaves. So housing or job searching is almost impossible for the rest of your life. As for how Japan deals with mental health issues, it's a bit ironic, given their high unaliving rates and stigma of mental health. But they surprisingly deal with it well for the homeless population, kinda. Over 30% of all people who experience homelessness at some point around the globe have struggled with a mental illness. Unlike other countries that might just put an individual with a mental health issue in an ordinary homeless shelter or facility, Japan moves those struggling with mental illness to a mental health facility. They simply have more space available. In Japan, there's 269 beds in mental health facilities per 100,000 people, while the rest of the world has an average of 68. This is because, for better or worse, they've lagged behind everyone else in the deinstitutionalization trend, which is the process of replacing long-stay psychiatric hospitals with less isolated community mental health services for those diagnosed with mental health issues. So, Japan's practice of institutionalizing those exhibiting signs of mental illness has helped reduce its homeless population out in the streets, but it doesn't equate to the best mental health care. But aside from all the efforts on the government's part to find housing arrangements for the homeless people in the country, there's some other reasons for the lack of homelessness that stem more from a purely cultural aspect than anything else. See, the Japanese government has received a lot of criticism from groups which claim that the number of homeless people in the country is much higher than the amounts reported by the government. This would make their nearly 0% homeless rate a lot less impressive. But why wouldn't the government's count be accurate? Is the government intentionally skewing the numbers? Well, perhaps not intentionally, but yes, there's a few legal, social, and cultural reasons that this could be happening. First, we have to take a look at how Japan legally defines homelessness. The definition is much narrower than the definition we might use for what it means to be homeless. The Japanese government defines it as people who live everyday life in public spaces, such as roads, parks, riversides, etc. So they're only counting people who literally live on the street, and not those in homeless shelters and facilities, who technically are without a home. And in Japan, people living on the street is a rarity because of the forced evictions from public spaces common in Japan. The country locks homeless people out of parks, builds anti-homeless architecture, and removes them from public areas. So the numbers of people on the street, or those who count as homeless in the eyes of the government, is very low. So where do all these hidden, undetected homeless people end up? Well, it's become common for some people without permanent residences to sleep in 24-hour cyber cafes. If they have part-time, low-paying jobs, they can cover the nightly cost of staying there while also staying off the streets by sleeping in computer cubicles at these cafes. At these places, they can receive a small space to sleep as well as access to the internet. These people are called internet cafe refugees. It's such a big thing that many cyber cafes now essentially double up as a hospitality business by offering food, drinks, and a shower to people who come to pay and stay. Gradually, this trend has developed into a flourishing industry. Since 2020, it's been estimated that a minimum of 15,000 individuals reside in cyber cafes in Tokyo alone, which is 5 times the official number of homeless people in Japan. This choice of shelter is especially popular among the younger homeless population. For context, in the official governmental count, almost all of the homeless people counted were over the age of 50. So this doesn't mean that most homeless people are old, it just means that younger homeless people aren't as easy to distinguish as homeless. They often bounce around between internet cafes, friends' homes, and 24-hour fast food restaurants. Now, you might be wondering why people would go to internet cafes rather than homeless shelters, especially since spending money to stay at these cafes night after night could add up for someone who's already low on funds as it was. Well, this leads me to what I really meant about the culture of Japan towards homelessness. There's absolutely no culture of compassion for homeless people in Japan, but rather never-ending shame, which leads a lot of Japanese homeless people to lose touch or cut ties with their friends and family to avoid embarrassment. Japanese culture is centered largely around self-reliance and hard work, so homeless people are often viewed as lazy, with no one else to blame but themselves. Oftentimes, other citizens even avoid looking at them, viewing them as an embarrassment. It's seen as a threat to a harmonious society in Japan, and as something that impedes on the beauty of cities like Tokyo. For these reasons, homeless people make a lot of effort to not appear homeless to others. For example, they'll rarely beg for money, if not take offense to it when offered, try to keep clean, and look well by using the many public restrooms and wash areas across the country. When homeless people are actually living on the streets, they set up their shelters along remote locations, such as riverbanks, to stay out of everyone's way. When they do have to sleep in high-traffic locations, they often pack up their belongings and remove themselves from such a location during peak hours. Shinjuku Central Park is a prime example of how this works. The stigma is especially strong for men, who make up over 90% of the nation's homeless population. Japanese culture dictates that women are supposed to be cared for, so there's less stigma around women who are homeless because it is not viewed as their fault, so they are more likely to receive help. On the other hand, homeless men are stereotyped to have become so running away from gambling debts, so they are less likely to receive the same help. This negative view of homelessness makes many people keep it a secret if they can, which leads to a worsening problem that no one's really aware of. But homelessness became more obvious in 2020 during the pandemic, when alternatives to homeless shelters, like 24-hour internet cafes, shut down. The government had to pivot to avoid having many more people suddenly sleeping on the streets. So it invested in several thousand rooms at hotels around Tokyo during the pandemic state of emergency. If the government hadn't done this, there likely would have been a major spike in how they perceive homeless people. As of now, Tokyo has long-term shelters similar to dorms throughout the city, largely run by non-profits. But these facilities have negative reputations, like being run down, overcrowded, and having little privacy. Japan doesn't support one-night shelters when people can come and receive shelter for just one night. Instead, the government prefers to offer long-term shelter so they can help people get to a place where they can support themselves. In recent years, Japan has also become more flexible in offering government money to homeless people who need it. Although their livelihood protection program has been around since the 2000s to provide homeless people with money if they have no assets or family to fall back on, the requirements used to be more stringent. People used to have to prove that their family was incapable of supporting them, which led to a lot of people not applying for the program because they didn't want their family to know that they were homeless. Now that requirement can be waived. Through the program, homeless people can receive about 53,700 yen, or about $448 per month, which can be used for apartment rent or for government-funded shelters, and about 75,000 yen, or $621 for living expenses. Beyond that, the government now offers independence support centers, which provide job-searching support for the unemployed. So Japan has used legislation to reduce homelessness rates, but the amount of hidden homelessness likely means there's a lot more work to be done. In fact, Japan has a higher poverty rate than the United States, with about 15% of the Japanese population considered impoverished, compared to about only 12% of Americans living in poverty, which of course seems like a contradiction to the low reported homeless rates. Perhaps the most important thing for Japan to do is to start changing the stigma around homelessness, since the stigma deters a lot of people who are struggling from seeking help. Making people view and treat homelessness as less shameful could encourage more participation in government programs with a better output. Regardless, Japan's homeless rate is still low, which is commendable, but it isn't 0% like claimed. That is the reality. Thank you for watching.